good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, David, and great to see Richard and, of course, John and Stephen over there, who's got a new lease of life, he tells me, with a one-year-old on the way, so or now on board, so all things that old are new again, mate. I've got to say, when I was asked to do this, it was with some trepidation, because this whole issue of Indigenous affairs has had a major impact upon my family for the last 17 years. And it opened a lot of scars, it opened a lot of bad memories, and it also gave me the opportunity to reach out to some communities and people that I hadn't spoken to for some time, just to see how they were, to check in, and in doing so to help me frame what I might talk about. And in discussions and with Andrew and David, we've changed over the period of the last few months how I would address this question. So let me just take you back a little bit. First of all, just to set the scene about why the question that David put to us all today is so pertinent, and that is, what might we have learnt, or should we have learnt, from our time in government and where we are today? In 2006, here in Canberra, I had a summit into abuse, neglect, and violence in remote communities. And I was pilloried from uphill and down Dale. The Western Australian Premier and others called me a bigot and you name it. Sadly, the New South Wales Minister ended up going to jail for child sexual offences. So they were the sort of calibre of some of the people sitting around the table with me. The irony never left me. So from the moment I came into this portfolio, it was clear from my ministerial letter of engagement by the Prime Minister that our focus should be on practical outcomes. And I'm a practical sort of bloke, so that sat well with me. I have a military background and I believed in getting my feet dirty and my hands dirty and getting on the ground, and that's what I undertook to do. I visited community after community, and I heard from people who don't have a voice, about what's happening in their lives being transmitted outside of those communities. And I tried to the best of my ability, to do something about that. And the further I got into it, the greater frustrated I became. Because as has been touched on here today with a number of the speakers, is where does the responsibility fall between state and federal jurisdictions? And only last night, in talking to a very learned gentleman who's been in the political field for a very long time, said to me, "Oh, you did that intervention thing in Queensland too, didn't you?" I said, "No." So we could only do it in the Territory because under our Constitution, we were only allowed to actually employ what we did in the Territory because it was subservient under the law or under the Constitution of the Federal Parliament. So David, in his introduction mentioned the Little Children Are Sacred report. This was a report that came about largely as a response to the noise that had been being made, and by a very brave woman called Nanette Rogers, who was a prosecutor out of Alice Springs, and she went on the Late Line program, and she gave chapter and verse about the things that she witnessed, the pain and the suffering and the abuse. And I think it was quite confronting to most Australians, and the Northern Territory government decided to have two people do an inquiry into it, as governments always do an inquiry, and hopefully time and passage of events will overtake that and we won't have to do anything about it. They then sat on that report for the best part of 6 months when they got it, and when we received it in the federal government, their response, where this report had found that on the 99 communities they had visited, every single one of them had instances of child sexual abuse and neglect. Not some, not many, every single one of them. And to any thinking Australian, any decent Australian, this was a fundamentally inappropriate, understated response. I think one additional policeman and one additional teacher was part of their response. And I remember, and I'll see if you do, John, your memory's actually better than mine in most things, but you walked into Parliament at question time and you came past me as you were about to sit at the dispatch box and said, "I think we should ban the alcohol." I had no idea what he was talking about. Parliament wasn't that bad. And I asked my staff to inquire as to where could this have come from. And it had come from the John Laws program, where you'd been confronted with that question earlier in the day. So at the end of question time, I said to John, look, I think we need to do a lot more than that, and undertook for me to go away and work quickly on a response. And we all know what that response was, what's now commonly known as the intervention into the Northern Territory. Here's the rub, is that in answering this question about what have we learnt and what should we have learnt, is that we had been talking about these issues and beating a drum and getting nowhere for now 18 months or 12 months. There had been numerous reports from very learned people across the states and the territories. And typically what governments had done in response, if we're talking about what do we learn, is they'd put in safe houses and they'd put in night patrols and there'd been mediation, but no one had actually come to deal with the real core of the issue. And that's what we attempted to do. So hence the intervention got underway. In 2006, I was in a town of Wadeye. Does anyone here know where Wadeye is? Thank you. So all about 3 or 4. There, John, funny you should mention, I'm glad you do. Wadeye is a tiny little community described by the Northern Territory today as a community of about 2,000 to 3,000 people. It's about 4 hours west of Darwin. It's remote. It's actually totally cut off through the wet most of the year, or throughout the wet season. It has 7 language groups in that community, and there is 1 business, which is owned community. There is no other community businesses there like you had anywhere else. The day I arrived, 35 houses, I think it was, 25 houses were destroyed in a riot, 25. A man had been speared in the leg. The school was closed. The nurses' quarters and the hospital were closed. The riot police were coming in. Australia heard all about it because I was there, and there was a journalist with me from what now defunct Bulletin. And it was a horrendous situation, and one which most Australians couldn't comprehend. Every house in the community had great big gibbers, rocks on them. It was the women and the children that had destroyed the houses. The toilets had been smashed. The windows had been smashed. The houses were now gone. This is Australia. Anyway, that was in 2007. Let me take you to May 2022. What was happening? We're in the middle of a federal election. What happened in Wadeye in May of 2022? 35 houses were destroyed. The school was closed. A man was killed. There was a riot of 500 people. 100 other houses were badly damaged. Can I seriously ask you to put your hand up if you are aware of that incident occurring? Thank you. Look around. This is a learned, educated room of Australians who are decision makers, have been, will be, could be. And we don't know about it. How many questions were asked of the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition by the press packs that were travelling with them during that campaign about this issue? None. Not one. Here we are, the irony of it, we're at the National Press Club, and we're talking about something as fundamental as that. Now, can I ask you this? If that riot had occurred, let's just say, for argument's sake, in the electorate of Kooyong, and the local Catholic school was closed, and they'd been running battles in the street with 500 people, and a man had been killed and 35 houses had been destroyed and another 100 houses had been badly damaged, there would be international outcry. But there wasn't a word spoken. The ABC did run it on regional radio, and I picked it up because an old school friend sent me the link, and I started asking journalists and questions about what they knew. Very senior people who said, oh, I vaguely heard about it. I mean, this is a commentary, and this is about what have we learnt, what should we have learnt, and where do we go to from here? Go back to the original circumstances. Because the Prime Minister of the country of the day had trust in me, I guess, and because we had actually led a crusade of having these people heard, it did become a national issue and a national crisis to be dealt with. Today, we allow ignorance, we allow our silence to ensure that the pain and the suffering that goes on in those communities to remain hidden. Yuendamu. Now that's been in the Australian, and I pay the Australian credit where it is due, have been speaking daily almost with commentary from Warren Mundine and Professor Langton saying, you know, why isn't there more being done? But no one else is picking up on it. So that takes me to a question that was raised earlier to you, Paul, about, you were asked about the medias and the response of the media's response. So, let's touch on a really touchy subject. There was an incident, an alleged incident, across the road in the Big House of sexual abuse, which has got to go before the courts, and I have no commentary to make on it, unlike some others. One account of one woman being allegedly abused. The outcry has been extraordinary, all the way to the Logies and everywhere in between. All of our morning programs, our afternoon programs, our evening programs, our newspapers has been full of it, about the toxic behaviour in Parliament House. It has led to the Prime Minister having to have inquiries, to be held personally responsible too, but also being him having to have inquiries and that this being dealt with. Now, I have no issue with that. We should have respectful workplaces, we should have safe workplaces, but where are the journalists? Where are the very same potentially and particularly women journalists who have championed the right of that individual when it comes to the individuals that are reporting in the Australian that it is their fault that their arms are being broken, that they're being abused by their partners, or the circumstances that have happened in in May of 2022. There is definitely silence. Now up in Queensland, the Queensland government, as a result of media pressure recently, has had to now take on a bunch of inquiries into a bunch of things, including the casinos, through to lobbyists, but it's because of pressure from the media. So what have we learnt? We learnt that unless you have a Prime Minister and a government that's prepared to actually make these things the centrepiece of your response and deal with it, nothing will happen. The only other alternative, if you have, is for the Fourth Estate to actually make it happen. So the real question isn't just for future governments, it's not just for us in this room, but it's for us to have a deeper look at ourselves as Australians. And our earlier speaker mentioned about, you know, the Australian ethos. Why is it that we find that we're capable of being concerned about and articulating our concerns about things such as the Parliament House alleged incident, but we can't talk about these horrendous issues that are happening daily? The Australian reported I think it's the Chief Magistrate or the equivalent in the Northern Territory, and she just gave a chapter and verse. Nanette Rogers came out again from Victoria and said it again. But they just seem to be voices in the wilderness. So unless the Prime Minister, Mr Albanese or Mr Dutton, actually now make it their business to make this a centre core issue, my plea to you all is, how do we do that? Because I'm at a loss to know what to do with it. And I am just a dinosaur calling from the past. That how do we get this into the public arena? Because if we don't, we are going to lose another generation. Now, in my paper, which is a very short paper, I talk about the facts and fiction that is Indigenous affairs, and I deal with housing. Now, so I'm just going to conclude on this, David, because I don't want to go on too long, and I've probably already overstayed my welcome. But all the talk now is about the Uluru Statement of the Heart, from the heart, and a voice to Parliament. And I have no issue with those things, none at all. Unless we use those as an excuse not to deal and talk about these really hard issues. Or if we abdicate responsibility, because see, if you're elected to the Big House, that is your job. You've been paid to deal with these issues, and to deal with terrorism, and to deal with border security, and to deal with economic woes, but also to deal with these issues. And you can bring in a national cabinet together the states and territories, because this is not limited to the Northern Territory. It is in Queensland, it is in WA, it is in South Australia. And we can deal with it, but there has to be the will to do it. But I put a challenge, and it's a shame there's no one here from the media other than your good self, so there's a lot of emphasis on you today to report this all back, Paul, is they're wanting a voice to Parliament, which will have capacity to deliver advice on policies, but not to deliver policies. Today, there's about 3.3% of the Australian population that identify as Aboriginal. So what is the percentage of the Australian population that is in the federal parliament from 1 July? It's about 4.4%. And the government, it'll be over 6%. In other words, Aboriginal people, First Australians, are going to be overrepresented in the parliament, who are elected by the Parliament under our current constitution. So instead of waiting for a voice to Parliament and a potential referendum or whatever, why don't we actually use the 10 people who come from the Greens, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party and the Lambie thingamajig, and actually see whether they have something to say, because they get to actually speak in the Parliament, they get to be on the committees, they get to actually have a vote. So why not Mr Albanese, with his breath of fresh air about a new way of governing, learning from the past, but then taking the opportunity of the future and saying, I have a breadth of knowledge and understanding and experience across political spectrums and geographical spectrums. I'm going to use that, and I'm not going to wait. And in dealing with it, I'm going to take on some of the big issues that confront Australia and what is undeniably a crisis. I thank you, David, and I thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity. I hope it's not just another voice in the wilderness, but hopefully one of you out there will somehow be able to spark some little bit of a flame which will enlighten Australia and to actually take us forward in a way that is doable. In conclusion, if we think that just putting in more safe houses or putting more money into letting people go back onto their homelands, read my chapter, because it's the learned voices of people like Galarrwuy Yunupingu, no less, who sat on his steps overlooking Ski Bay and told me, you stupid white fellas keep building more houses in remote communities, in homelands, when people only go to homelands to run away from the pain and the suffering. Stop it. Thank you.